My flight got canceled, and I came home at 3 in the morning to find some random dude answering my door. When he yelled back into the house, asking who was there, I heard my fiancée Natasha tell him to say she was sleeping. Yeah, that's how I found out. The airport was dead when they announced the cancellation over the intercom system. I'd been stuck in meetings all day that should have been emails, the kind where everyone talks in circles for hours without actually deciding anything. Then, I ended up trying to sleep on those awful plastic chairs that smell like old food and broken dreams. They offered hotel vouchers, but I just wanted my own bed, my own space, my own life. My flight wasn't supposed to land until morning, so nobody expected me back, especially not Natasha. That should have felt normal, comforting even. It didn't. Something in my gut felt off the entire drive home. Driving through empty streets at 3 a.m. felt surreal, like the world was on pause and I was the only thing moving through some kind of frozen simulation. The traffic lights changed for nobody. The sidewalks were empty, and every storefront was dark except for the occasional neon sign buzzing in the silence. I saw our house from down the block with one light on in the bedroom window, that warm yellow glow spilling through the curtains. I actually smiled, thinking she'd fallen asleep with the TV on again, probably watching one of those cooking shows she loved. Then I unlocked the front door and it opened from the inside before I could even turn the handle all the way. This guy I'd never seen stood there, barefoot in just jeans, no shirt, looking like he'd just rolled out of my bed. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. We both froze for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 3 or 4 seconds. My brain was trying to process what I was seeing, trying to make it make sense, but there was no logical explanation that didn't end in betrayal. Then he shouted toward the hallway, super casual, like he owned the place. Like this was his house and I was the intruder. That's when I heard Natasha's voice from upstairs, sleepy and playful, telling him not to answer the door. The guy muttered something I couldn't make out and brushed past me, heading for the back door, moving fast but trying not to look like he was running. Never looked back. Never apologized, never acknowledged what was happening. I could have stopped him, demanded answers, thrown a punch, called the cops, done literally anything. I just stood there in my own doorway like a statue. The silence after he left felt like it was sucking the air out of the house, making it hard to breathe. Natasha came down the hallway wearing my shirt, the blue one I'd been looking for all week. Her hair messy like she'd just woken up, face white as paper. She looked confused at first, like she couldn't understand why I was standing there, then terrified when reality hit her. She asked why I was home early like I'd committed some crime, like I was the one who'd done something wrong. I didn't say anything. I walked past her without making eye contact, sat at the kitchen table and put my phone face down in front of me. I wanted her to feel every second of that silence, every uncomfortable moment, every drop of tension hanging in the air between us. She started spinning stories, each one more desperate than the last. First, it was the neighbor checking on her because she'd heard a noise outside. Then it was her cousin stopping by unexpectedly from out of town. Then she didn't know who he was and thought maybe he'd broken in. The lies came out fast, one tripping over the other, each contradiction making the next one less believable. I didn't respond to any of it. I just sat there looking at her, watching her unravel. The silence made her fall apart faster than yelling ever could. Eventually, she started crying. Real tears or fake ones, I couldn't tell anymore. She asked if we could talk in the morning when we were both calmer, that she'd explain everything and it would all make sense. I told her I'd stay just for tonight. Her relief was instant, way too instant. She thought that meant forgiveness, that we'd work through this like couples do. It didn't mean that at all. She went upstairs probably to delete messages and cover her tracks. I stayed down in the kitchen, staring at a half-empty wine glass on the counter with a lipstick stain on the rim, the same shade she always wore. Then I noticed some car keys lying next to it with a small metallic emblem dangling from the keychain, an engraved logo that said Thornton Development, Natasha's dad's company. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands. I'd worked there years ago before we even started dating, back when I was just another project coordinator trying to make a name for myself. I knew those initials by heart. RTC, Randall Thornton Construction. Whoever that guy was, he worked for her father. It wasn't just cheating. It was stupid, arrogant, careless stupidity. She'd brought someone from her dad's company into our home, into our bed, someone who could destroy both our lives if this got out. I left before sunrise without waking her, moving quietly through the house like a ghost. Just grabbed my phone and wallet, left everything else behind. My car was at the curb where I'd parked it, and I noticed another vehicle parked 2 houses down. A silver sedan with the same Thornton Development logo on the windshield sticker. So he hadn't gone far. I sat in my car and waited, engine off, watching the house in my rearview mirror. The porch light came on after about 10 minutes, and a shadow moved behind the upstairs curtain. The guy had come back, probably thought the coast was clear. I watched him walk quickly to the car, glancing around nervously like he was worried someone might see him, then drive off into the pre-dawn darkness. My chest didn't burn with rage the way I expected it to. It went cold, ice cold. Natasha hadn't been trying to hide him at all. She'd been comfortable, confident that I wouldn't find out, that she had everything under control. That confidence was going to cost her everything she had. When she woke up that morning, I was gone. But I made sure the silence stayed with her in other ways. Every joint account frozen, every credit card canceled, mortgage account password changed. Not revenge, just precaution. I knew her patterns, knew how she operated. She'd try to spin this whole thing, manipulate her father with tears and half-truths, play the sufferer card like she always did when things went wrong. I had to control the narrative before she could twist it into something unrecognizable. By 9 a.m., I was sitting at a coffee shop near the downtown construction offices, laptop open, nursing a black coffee that tasted like burnt rubber. I hadn't slept at all, but my mind was sharp, running on pure adrenaline and anger. I looked up the employee list from an old contact database I still had access to from my time at the company. The name appeared faster than I expected. Garrett Pembroke, project manager. That was him. I pulled up his employee profile, and there was his face, that same smug expression I'd seen in my doorway. Married with 2 kids and a reputation for taking credit for other people's work. I remembered his face from a company barbecue years back. One of those mandatory fun events where everyone pretends to enjoy themselves. Loud laugh, expensive watch. The kind of guy who called women sweetheart, even when it wasn't appropriate. Natasha had chosen him not because he was better than me in any meaningful way, but because he was convenient. Close enough to feel thrilling, safe enough to seem temporary, connected enough to her world that it felt natural. By afternoon, she'd left a dozen messages and twice as many texts saying we needed to talk, that it wasn't what I thought, that I should come home so before things got worse, that she loved me and we could fix this. I ignored every single one of them. She had no idea that worse had already started, that the wheels were already in motion. When I finally returned that evening around 7, she was on the couch pretending to be calm, trying to look composed. She tried to smile and make small talk like nothing had happened, asking about my day like we were a normal couple. Her phone kept lighting up on the coffee table with messages she pretended not to see, flipping it face down every time a notification came through. I told her she didn't need to explain anything to me. She blinked, confused, probably expecting me to yell or demand answers, until I added that I'd already spoken to her father about everything. Her color drained instantly, all the blood rushing from her face. I hadn't actually called Randall yet, but her reaction confirmed everything I needed to know. That's when I realized this wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was an opportunity, a chance to rebuild everything on my own terms. I went upstairs, packed a bag with just the essentials, and left again without telling her where I was going, or if I'd be back, or what my plans were. That night, driving through the city with the windows down and cold air rushing in, I realized the exact moment everything ended wasn't when I found out she cheated. It was when I decided I wouldn't forgive her, when I made the conscious choice to walk away completely. Forgiveness is what people give when they still have hope, when they still believe things can go back to how they were. I had none of that left, only plans, and the first one would start the next morning with a phone call to Randall Thornton himself. I woke up in my car parked 3 blocks from Thornton Development, neck stiff from sleeping at an awkward angle. I hadn't slept more than an hour, but adrenaline had completely replaced rest, flooding my system with energy. Randall had always treated me like the son he wished he had, the responsible one who showed up on time and followed through on commitments. When Natasha and I got engaged, he congratulated me with an envelope containing a down payment for our house, $20,000 in a cashier's check. He said I was the steady type his daughter needed, someone who would ground her. That used to sound flattering, like a compliment. Now it just felt like a prediction, like he'd known all along she needed someone to clean up her messes. Steady men make easy targets because they're predictable, reliable, easy to take advantage of. I walked into his office building around 9, straightening my shirt and trying to look more put together than I felt. The receptionist recognized me instantly, smiled warmly, and told me Randall was in a meeting, but should be out soon. I waited in the lobby watching employees rush by with their arms full, holding blueprints and coffee cups and nervous energy. Among them, I caught sight of Garrett Pembroke, walking fast down the hallway. He didn't notice me at first, too focused on his phone pressed to his ear, voice low and angry, like he was arguing with someone. When he finally saw me sitting there, he froze mid-step with that same deer in headlights look from my doorway, eyes going wide. He stammered out a greeting that didn't sound like actual words and quickly disappeared into the hallway like he was being chased. I smiled for the first time since that night, a cold smile that didn't reach my eyes. When Randall finally came out of his meeting about 20 minutes later, his usual confident energy faltered slightly when he saw me sitting there. He invited me into his office with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, asked about my business trip, joked that Natasha had been glued to her phone the whole time, waiting for my return. The irony almost made me laugh out loud. I told him the flight had gotten canceled due to weather, and I'd gotten back early, around 3 in the morning actually. I mentioned seeing Garrett casually, as if making small talk, said I was glad Randall had someone like him mentoring Natasha's team on the new projects. His brow furrowed immediately, confusion crossing his face. He said Natasha didn't work under Garrett's department, and there was no reason they'd have any contact outside the occasional board events or company gatherings. That was my first real confirmation beyond what I'd already seen. The pieces were falling into place. Before I left, Randall invited us both to dinner later that week to discuss wedding plans and some new family developments he wanted to share. I agreed without hesitation, knowing that dinner would be the perfect stage for the next act of this whole mess. When I got home, Natasha was pacing the living room like a caged animal, eyes red and swollen from crying, phone clutched in her hand like a lifeline. The moment she saw me walk through the door, she started talking fast, words tumbling. I'm saying she'd been worried sick, that we needed to talk before her dad heard anything from anyone else. She must have already known somehow that he'd seen me at the office. Maybe Garrett had warned her. I told her to sit down, my voice flat and emotionless. No anger, no shouting, just that same flat calm that seemed to unsettle her more than yelling would have. I placed my laptop on the coffee table and opened our shared account transactions, the ones she thought I never checked. There they were. Hotel bookings in her name, charged to my card dating back 3 months, 2 different cities, multiple weekends I thought she'd spent visiting her mother who lived upstate. She looked at the screen like it was written in another language, like she couldn't comprehend what she was seeing. When she started denying it, saying there must be some mistake, I opened the drawer next to the couch and placed the keychain from that night beside her on the cushion. She went pale, all the color draining from her face in an instant. She said she'd made mistakes, that Garrett was helping her through a difficult time, that she felt neglected. Every excuse felt rehearsed like she'd been preparing for weeks. I listened without interruption. When she ran out of words, I told her about the message I'd received that morning from Garrett's wife, Vivienne. Natasha's eyes widened in horror. Vivienne had called me after finding messages between her husband and Natasha on their shared tablet. She wasn't angry, just exhausted. She said she'd known something was off for months, but never imagined it was someone connected to Randall's family. She asked to meet. I told Natasha I'd agreed. The color drained completely from her face. She started pacing again, mumbling that I didn't understand, that Vivienne was unstable. But her panic told me everything. I met Vivienne at a diner near the highway. She looked older than her age, with quiet resignation that comes after years of disappointment. She said Garrett had been siphoning money from Randall's company through dummy suppliers, and that Natasha's name appeared in the paperwork as one of the consulting partners. Whether Natasha knew what she was signing didn't matter. The trail existed. Vivienne showed me copies of invoices and bank transfers. I recognized Natasha's signature. My fiancé wasn't just cheating. She was helping commit financial fraud. Vivienne said she didn't plan to report it immediately. She wanted to corner Garrett first. She asked for my help gathering more evidence, saying it could clear Natasha if she cooperated. I told her I'd think about it. I wasn't doing this for Natasha's sake. I wanted to know how deep the rot went. When I got home that night, Natasha was waiting, eyes swollen, wine glass in hand. The house smelled like desperation. She started talking the moment I entered, saying she'd end it with Garrett, that she wanted to fix things. She promised it was over. I stood there, letting her speak until she said something that froze me completely. She said she was pregnant. The words landed without sound. I looked at her. She wasn't crying anymore. She was studying me, trying to read my face, waiting for any sign of softness. She didn't get one. I asked how far along. She said around 8 weeks. The timeline lined up perfectly with the first hotel booking. She said she wasn't sure who the father was. The way she said it, flat and emotionless, like a business statement, made my hands tremble for the first time. I left again that night without slamming the door or saying anything. I needed distance because for the first time, anger wasn't enough. It was contamination. Over the next few days, Vivian and I exchanged information back and forth through encrypted emails and coffee shop meetings. She was smarter than I expected, calm and methodical and organized, driven by purpose rather than vengeance or emotion. Together, we pieced together enough documents and evidence to expose both Garrett and Natasha if we wanted to go that route. Bank statements, email threads, text message screenshots, everything we needed. Then Randall called out of the blue. He said he wanted to host a private dinner to rebuild trust and connection before the wedding, to get everyone back on the same page. He said Natasha had told him we'd been arguing about finances and wedding stress. He had absolutely no idea the real storm was just beginning to form. I told him we'd be there without hesitation. I hadn't seen Natasha face to face for 3 days before the dinner. She'd been texting constantly throughout each day, sometimes apologetic and begging, sometimes furious and accusatory, sometimes pretending nothing had happened at all. I didn't reply to a single message. I wanted her to walk into that restaurant completely blind, without knowing what I had planned or what was coming. Randall had chosen an upscale place downtown, one of those restaurants where the portions are tiny and the prices are astronomical, with a private dining room reserved under his name. I arrived early wearing the same navy suit from our engagement party. The one she'd said made me look handsome and successful. I placed a small black folder in front of my seat at the table. Inside were copies of all the documents Vivian and I had compiled over the past few days. Invoices with forged signatures, signed authorizations for fake consulting work, bank transfer records, and the paternity test I'd paid for discreetly through a private clinic that didn't ask questions. Natasha didn't know about any of it. I'd managed to retrieve a DNA sample from her used toothbrush one morning, and a strand of hair she'd left on my jacket after one of her crying sessions. At 6 sharp, Randall entered first, looking proud and confident, carrying that air of a man who believed family dinners and honest conversations could fix anything that was broken. Natasha followed a few steps behind, wearing a pale blue dress that I'd bought her for her birthday and a smile that didn't reach her eyes or look remotely genuine. Her gaze darted nervously to the black folder on the table, then to my face, searching for clues. She didn't ask what it was, but her fingers twitched anxiously when she reached for her chair and sat down. Garrett arrived minutes later, fashionably late enough to appear self-important and busy. He had that smug, polished look of a man who always thought he'd land on his feet no matter what happened. Vivian came last, technically uninvited but expected by me. I'd told her to come quietly and sit through the first half without saying anything. She agreed to the plan. She wanted him humiliated publicly in front of everyone before his final fall from grace. Randall started the dinner with polite talk about wedding dates and potential venues, asking if we'd decided between spring or fall. I played along perfectly, answering his questions as if nothing had happened, as if my world hadn't imploded 3 days ago. Natasha smiled tightly across from me, hands trembling slightly under the table, where she thought nobody could see. The silence that followed dessert, after the plates had been cleared and coffee had been served, was the opening I'd been waiting for all night. I leaned forward slowly, slid the black folder across the polished table, and told Randall in a calm voice that there was something he should see before the wedding moved forward. He frowned, slightly confused, but opened it anyway. The first page read in bold letters, "Unauthorized Consultant Transactions, Thornton Development Projects, Quarter 2. He flipped through the pages methodically, eyes narrowing with each line he read, his expression darkening. Natasha's signature appeared repeatedly alongside Garrett's on document after document. The total amount siphoned was small enough to avoid immediate suspicion from auditors, but large enough to indicate clear intent and planning. When Randall looked up from the documents, confusion had already turned to disbelief, and then to something darker. Natasha started speaking fast, words tumbling over each other, insisting she didn't understand what those papers were or where they came from. Garrett's face went pale white, all the smugness draining away in seconds. Vivian reached calmly into her purse and placed a small flash drive next to the folder on the table. She said in a quiet, steady voice that it contained audio recordings of Garrett discussing those exact accounts with Natasha over the phone, planning how to move money without detection. That was the first explosion of the evening. Randall's hand trembled visibly as he poured himself a drink from the bottle on the table. He muttered under his breath that he'd built his company from the ground up over 30 years, that no one, especially not his own daughter, would stain it for quick money and cheap thrills. Natasha reached desperately for his arm, but he pushed her hand away roughly. When the shouting finally quieted down and everyone was breathing hard, I reached for the folder again and pulled out one more document from the back, the one I'd been saving, the paternity report. I said calmly that I'd had it tested privately after Natasha's confession about the pregnancy. My voice was controlled and steady, almost clinical. The report confirmed exactly what I already knew in my gut. The child wasn't mine. It was Garrett's. The DNA match was 99.9% certain. Natasha froze completely, her entire body going rigid. Randall stared at her with his mouth slightly open, face completely blank like his brain had stopped processing. Garrett tried desperately to deny it, his voice rising, saying it was a setup, that I'd fabricated the whole thing to humiliate him and destroy his marriage. I told him very calmly that I didn't need to fabricate anything at all. The clinic's verification was notarized and legally binding. Vivian didn't move a muscle. She just sat there watching him destroy himself with his own words, watching everything she'd suspected for months finally confirmed in black and white. The second explosion was louder than the first. Natasha broke down sobbing into her hands. Randall stood up so suddenly his chair fell backward. He shouted that she'd embarrassed him, betrayed his trust, and ruined the company's reputation. Garrett tried to leave, but Randall stepped in front of him, shaking with rage. Then came the third and final blow. Vivian reached into her bag and placed one last item on the table, a printed email exchange between Garrett and Randall's financial officer. It revealed that Garrett had used Randall's company name to secure unapproved loans through subsidiary accounts. Natasha's consulting signature had verified them. That revelation connected every thread. Not only had she destroyed our relationship, but she'd also helped jeopardize her father's entire business empire. The table fell silent, except for the low hum of the air conditioner. I didn't say anything. There was no need. Randall's company would be investigated within days. Garrett's career was over. Natasha's name was on documents she couldn't explain. She looked at me then, eyes red and desperate. For the first time, she understood. This wasn't anger anymore. It was closure. She whispered something under her breath that I couldn't hear. Maybe apologizing, maybe cursing me, maybe begging for help. I didn't ask. Vivian stood and walked out first. Garrett followed, muttering threats no one listened to. Randall stayed seated, rubbing his temples. He asked me what I planned to do now. I told him I was done with Natasha, but I wanted to make sure his company survived the scandal. He nodded slowly, almost ashamed, and said he'd transfer ownership of one of their smaller divisions to me to protect it legally during the audit. When the dinner ended, Natasha didn't move. She sat there staring at the empty glass in front of her, face streaked with tears, makeup fading under the soft restaurant lights. I left her there. By the time I got home, her belongings were already packed. I'd done it the night before, expecting this ending. Everything she owned was stacked neatly in boxes by the door. The engagement ring sat on top. I didn't wait for her to arrive. I left the keys on the counter and drove to a hotel. When she finally came home that night, she found a single envelope taped to the door. Inside was the deed to the small apartment we first rented when we started dating, signed over to her name. There was no note, no goodbye, nothing left to explain. It wasn't revenge. It was balance. The next morning, I received a call from Randall around 8 a.m. He said Garrett had been fired effective immediately, and that auditors were already combing through the books, looking for more irregularities. He sounded like a broken man, his voice hollow and defeated, thanking me for my discretion and for not destroying the family publicly in the media. I told him the truth as gently as I could. It had destroyed itself long before I arrived at that dinner with my folder. When I hung up the phone, I realized something strange. I didn't feel satisfaction or pain or vindication, just quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't sting or heal, it just settles into your bones. I checked my phone one more time. No messages from Natasha, no missed calls, no desperate voicemails. She was gone from my life. And for once in weeks, silence felt right and natural. The morning after the dinner, the world felt oddly quiet and still. I woke up to sunlight leaking through the hotel curtains, surrounded by the faint smell of new carpet and industrial disinfectant. There were no unread messages waiting for me, no angry calls, no tearful apologies, just stillness and silence. It was a different kind of peace, the kind that comes only after everything collapses completely and there's nothing left to salvage or save. By noon, the first tremors began rippling through the business community. Randall's company was in complete chaos. Auditors had started their review, and word spread faster than I expected through industry contacts. Garrett tried desperately to frame it as a misunderstanding, a clerical error, but Vivian Ann had already handed over her recordings and duplicate invoices to the authorities. His entire scheme unraveled in less than 48 hours. The same arrogance that made him think he could have my fiancée and her father's company at the same time made him sloppy and careless with the details. Natasha called once that day around 3 in the afternoon. I let it go straight to voicemail without even considering answering. Her message was long and rambling, full of sobs and circular sentences that went nowhere. She claimed she didn't know about the fraud, that Garrett had manipulated her into signing things, that she only wanted to help him with legitimate consulting work. She said she didn't want to lose me, that we could still fix this somehow. The message ended with a whisper somewhere, between a plea and a command. Please don't ruin me. But I didn't have to ruin her. She was already doing that perfectly well on her own without any help from me. Within a week, Randall stepped down as CEO of his own company. His name had become toxic among investors and clients, even though the auditors hadn't actually charged him personally with any wrongdoing. He liquidated several major assets and sold off part of the company to protect what remained. He called me again one last time, this time not as a businessman, but as a father who'd failed. He didn't ask for forgiveness or understanding, only for silence and discretion. He said he'd always respected me and admired my work ethic, and that he was sorry his daughter hadn't valued what she had. I told him it wasn't my silence he needed to worry about. It was his daughter's honesty that had been the problem all along. After that conversation, he never called again. Natasha moved out quietly over the course of a weekend. Her father gave her one last check, a settlement of sorts to help her start over. Enough money to keep her from collapsing completely, but not nearly enough to rebuild the comfortable life she'd destroyed with her choices. She rented a small apartment downtown in a neighborhood she used to call sketchy, and disappeared completely from everyone's radar. 2 months passed slowly. I spent most of that time working obsessively without taking breaks, throwing myself into projects. The office became my shelter and my sanctuary. I used the portion of Randall's company that I'd taken over as part of the settlement and merged it strategically into my own practice. By the 3rd month, Brennan Urban Design was officially registered with the state. It wasn't grand or flashy, but it was mine, completely mine. Built clean from the ground up with no lies in its foundation. Then, one rainy afternoon in late autumn, Vivian came to my office unannounced. She looked calmer than the last time I'd seen her at that disastrous dinner. Tired but lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted. She carried a small folder and a cup of coffee for me, remembered how I took it. She said Garrett had fled the state after the audit results went public and charges were filed. His accounts were frozen, his professional license revoked permanently. She'd filed for divorce, and it had been finalized the week before. She handed me the folder across my desk, copies of the legal filings and her finalized settlement agreement. She said simply that it was over. Finally over. We sat in silence for a while, just listening to the rain drumming against the windows and the distant sound of traffic below. I expected awkwardness or tension, but there wasn't any of that. Just understanding and mutual respect. Two people who'd been collateral damage in someone else's chaos and selfishness, now sitting on the other side of it, trying to figure out what came next. Before she left, she said something I didn't forget, something that stuck with me. She said, "We're the lucky ones, you know, We got out before the whole building fell down on top of us. I thought about that for a long time after she left. After she left, I worked until well past midnight, losing myself in blueprints and designs. The city lights outside blurred into streaks across the rain-covered window. I wasn't sure if I was rebuilding my life or simply running away from the wreckage of what it used to be. But for the first time in months, it didn't matter which one it was. The line between escape and progress had vanished completely. Then one night in December, when the first snow was falling, Natasha reached out again. She sent a message at 2:14 in the morning, just a single photo with no words. It was of a baby crib still empty, sitting next to a hospital bed with white sheets. No caption, no explanation, no context. I stared at it for a minute, then deleted it without replying. 2 days later, a short letter arrived, in the mail, handwritten on cream-colored stationery. Her handwriting was shaky, but still recognizable, still hers. She wrote that Garrett had vanished completely, that his accounts were gone, and all his assets seized, and she was left to handle everything alone. She said she'd given birth to a boy, but didn't have the courage to put his father's name on the birth certificate. She asked if I'd ever consider meeting him, not as a father figure, but as someone who once loved her and might understand. I read the letter twice, slowly, letting each word sink in, then tore it in half and dropped both pieces in the trash can beside my desk. Whatever pity I had left for her wasn't love or affection. It was just fatigue, exhaustion from carrying the weight of what we used to be. She wasn't part of my story anymore, wasn't part of my future. She was just a footnote in the blueprint of who I'd become, a cautionary tale I'd tell myself when I needed to remember why trust matters. Months passed quietly after that. My company grew steadily, one project at a time. We landed a major redevelopment contract in the spring, ironically on one of the same projects that Randall's firm had lost during the scandal. The investors called it a clean start and a fresh perspective. I called it symmetry, the universe balancing itself out. That same week, I received an unexpected parcel at the office, with no return address on the label. Inside was a small black velvet box that I recognized instantly. The same one I'd used to hold Natasha's engagement ring when I proposed. When I opened it carefully, the ring was gone, probably sold or pawned. In its place was a man's wristwatch, expensive and distinctive, the same one Garrett used to wear on his left wrist. The same one I'd seen him wearing that night when I came home early and found him in my doorway. The back of the watch was engraved with small letters. He was never worth it. I didn't know whether Natasha had sent it as some kind of apology or if it was some last bitter gesture from Garrett before vanishing completely. But either way, it was the final echo of that night. I placed the watch carefully in my desk drawer and locked it away without another thought. Time, I realized, had done what I couldn't do myself. It had erased her from my daily life, from my thoughts, from my future. A year later, Brennan Urban Design won a National Architecture Award for its first project, an urban housing redevelopment named Project 3 AM. It wasn't a coincidence. That was the hour everything began to change, the moment the truth opened my front door and walked straight into my life. When I stood on stage to accept the award, I thought about the man I'd been that night, tired, trusting, half asleep, to the life he thought he was living. That version of me was gone. What replaced him wasn't bitterness, just clarity. After the ceremony, I walked out into the city night. The air was cool, the streets wet from a light drizzle. Neon signs reflected across the puddles, painting the pavement in shifting colors. Somewhere out there, Natasha existed. Perhaps struggling, perhaps pretending she was fine. It didn't matter anymore. I took out my phone and deleted her last message. Then I looked at the skyline, the tall steel structures cutting into the fog. I'd built something that wouldn't fall apart. When a door opened at 3 a.m., the past wasn't gone. But it was quiet now, and for the first time since that night, I went home. Not to a house, but to a life that was completely mine.